Welcome to my channel, guys. Today what I'm talking about is how Cavalry FC's recent performances have put the Canadian Premier League on the map. Now first of all, please like and subscribe if you enjoy this video at the end of the video. And now let's get on to the video. I just want to preface this by saying that the Canadian Premier League is a small community, so any bit of media attention that we get is very big. Any surge in attention that we get from fans is also very big. As a Toronto FC fan, I've experienced it over the years. Just a few years ago, whenever I would talk about Toronto FC, sometimes it felt like the people didn't even know what Toronto FC was. They're kind of thinking, is that a Canadian football team? Or is that soccer? Like, what is that? And now, with Toronto FC winning the 2017 MLS Cup, and there's still people like that, but there's definitely a lot less, and people are a lot more interested in the team. And I was always talking about Toronto FC and people weren't really that interested, but over time, especially with the 2016 MLS Cup where we lost versus Seattle Sounders, where we surged in the playoffs there, people started actually watching the games, and it was neat for people that I knew. For the first time I could actually have a conversation with them about how Toronto FC played last night. When before people were just kind of like, dude, I don't care, which is still kind of like how they are until they get into the playoffs. But it's a lot nicer for people to actually be interested in the team when they're in the playoffs versus not being interested in the team at all. And my point with this whole thing about Toronto FC is that's the same with the Canadian Premier League. Most people in Canada don't know what the Canadian Premier League is. But when you have big results versus Vancouver Whitecaps versus Montreal Impact, or Forge FC had a good result versus Antigua the other day, these are big results as people finally find out about the league. Either they heard about the league and now with that result they consider that they might actually go to the game, or they've just heard about the league for the first time ever, and now it might take a few more actions for them to go to a game. But anyway, these results are very big results. I first found out about the Canadian Premier League on Waking the Red. I have written articles for Waking the Red, and I saw a few articles, more of the headlines, and I didn't really click on them at first. I didn't really think much about them. And then eventually I clicked on them and I started getting interested in the Canadian Premier League. And then of course I started making videos on this channel about the Canadian Premier League. And it took a few times to really get interested into the league. I saw the articles multiple times and I didn't click on them. And then eventually I did. And with big results against Vancouver and Montreal, those results will bring more attention to the league. I remember listening just the other day to one of the previous MLS Extra Time Radio podcasts. It's created by people who work for Major League Soccer, and they gave a quick little shout out to Cavalry FC when they ended up beating Vancouver Whitecaps.
Wait, can we shout out Cavalry? It's the first Canadian team to knock out an MLS team. Like, that's pretty cool. Yeah, Sergio Camargo playing on that team, Julian Boucher. It's like some former MLS dudes, and now they'll play Montreal, who actually only squeaked by.
And by the way, Piatti's back and he scored a goal.
Boom. But they only squeaked by on the Forge, so it wasn't an easy run for them. So congrats to the Canadian Premier League this quickly to get that type of production and put out that competition.
They didn't talk much about Cavalry FC. They maybe talked about Cavalry FC for about 10 seconds where they gave that shout out and talked about Vancouver Whitecaps for like 4 minutes about how they're failing and all that. But the reality is that type of attention is very valuable for someone who's in the Canadian Premier League community and for other people who are in it as well. And it brings a lot of much needed attention for the league, especially in the first year. If we want to increase attendances, if we want to have bigger viewership in the league next year. So now I'm going to talk specifically about results. So the Vancouver Whitecaps game. That was the first fixture that an MLS team lost to a non-MLS team since the first year of the competition, where Montreal Impact, who were in USL Pro at the time, beat the only MLS team there, Toronto FC, and ended up winning the championship because of that. But that hasn't happened since then. and MLS teams have gotten a lot better. And in the first year of the Canadian Premier League, a Canadian Premier League team has beaten an MLS team through beating Vancouver Whitecaps. And, you know, as someone who watches MLS a little bit, I haven't watched them too much. I haven't watched Vancouver Whitecaps too much this year. I've just watched Toronto FC this year, but Vancouver Whitecaps are one of the worst teams in the league, and they're arguably having their worst season ever. But that doesn't take away from the result that Cavalry FC got. Cavalry FC only have a fraction of the salary of those Vancouver Whitecaps players, and Vancouver didn't play many of their backup players against Cavalry FC, at least in Vancouver. So that was a huge result that Cavalry FC took away and ended up moving on versus Montreal Impact. And then they also increased social media followers. Like on Twitter, I saw that they actually increased followers after that. And I believe the Canadian Premier League increased followers too. So it's not too significant in terms of a point, but it's significant in terms of proof of the point that people are getting intrigued by the Canadian Premier League because of results like that. Even Mark Dos Santos said about how he would consider signing some Cavalry FC players, which I'm not going to look too deep into that because, you know, I think he's just complimenting the team there, but I think that gives proof to a point also that when teams like Cavalry FC do well against an MLS team, it shows that the league is fairly good even though they have low salaries, and it makes players more intrigued to move to the Canadian Premier League because they see the quality is there. You know, people like Pity Martinez and Ezekiel Barco moved to Atlanta United because they saw the qualities growing in MLS, and they saw the ambition from Atlanta United to get better, and they saw the fact that they can use MLS as a springboard into the Premier League, and that's what Miguel Almiron used to get into the Premier League, where he's now one of the star players for Newcastle United. So the increase in quality in MLS from, you know, the Eric Wijnaldum days of 1996 and David Beckham days of 2010 and all those days, you know, we've seen the increase in quality over time, and that's why players like Pity Martinez and Ezekiel Barco have moved to Atlanta because they see the quality there and they see the chance and opportunity for them to really improve themselves in Atlanta and eventually move on. The same thing's going to happen in the Canadian Premier League. When they see this quality and they see players like Tristan Borges playing quite well and Kyle Becker playing well, and, you know, Cavalry FC playing well as a whole, they see the fact that there's quality in the Canadian Premier League, and say if you're an MLS player who didn't perform the best at their MLS team and they got released at the end of the season, they might consider going to the Canadian Premier League as they have a bit more job security than the USL. So that is a major gain by this win by Cavalry FC versus Vancouver. Now talking about Montreal Impact. Now I believe this is Cavalry FC's first ever sellout game versus any team. So versus Montreal Impact, they got over 5,000 people. It was a packed stadium, and they performed quite well in front of Montreal, which once again shows the quality in the league. Unfortunately, they lost though. They lost 1-0 to Montreal Impact. They lost 3-1 on aggregate. Of course, they lost 2-1 to Montreal in Montreal. But it really shows the quality, and it shows how good the league's getting over time. Might lead to more people buying tickets to games to Cavalry FC, to teams all across the league, because they see the quality is there and it's not just a crapshoot league that they should just ignore and continue to watch the Premier League or leagues like that. It's a pretty exciting team to watch. They're all pretty exciting teams to watch. Well, the league's pretty exciting as a whole, so maybe you should go and consider watching it. And then once again, followers for Cavalry FC on Twitter increased quite a bit after the match. There's a bit of momentum for Cavalry FC in terms of getting Twitter followers after these games. The Canadian Premier League on this game didn't really increase much in followers, but my point is, again, is that this is proof of a point that when Canadian Premier League teams play well, or just play against these MLS teams, but you know, they prove themselves a certain amount against these MLS teams, people are more intrigued by the league and they might consider watching it. You know, if you're in one of those markets, you're in Victoria, BC, and You know, you see this Cavalry game, you might think, well, maybe the league is better than I thought it is, so I'll go and watch a Pacific FC game. Even if you're not in a market for the Canadian Premier League, like me, you know, I want a team to come in Waterloo region. You might start drumming up support for a Canadian Premier League team to come to your city or to your region or to your area. And you might start watching it just as a neutral, like how I have for the past few months. My thesis with this is that if you're a fan of a Canadian Premier League team, even if you're a fan of Cavalry FC's rivals, FC Edmonton, or Forge FC's rivals, York 9 FC, no matter what team's in the Canadian Championship going far, or in the CONCACAF League going far, or whatever tournament, you should cheer for them, because them doing well won't just help out their team, it will help out the whole league, because more players will consider going to that league. They'll consider going to a wide variety of teams, maybe more specifically Cavalry FC or Forge FC, but they'll be more inclined to go to other teams like Pacific FC, like FC Edmonton, like York 9 FC, Halifax Wanderers, Valor FC. You know, not just those teams, and there'll be more people willing to buy a ticket to those games, even if they're not Cavalry FC or Forge FC, which means more money's invested in those teams, which means that the level of play might go up because the owners are willing to invest more in the team, as there's actual revenue streams being created, quite big ones, and it just improves Canadian soccer all across the board, and it increases the level of play that you'll be watching when you're watching the Canadian Premier League. Anyway, thank you for watching this video. Please like and subscribe, and until next time, see ya.